You ever get megalophobia from a game box? Steel Battalion, known in Japan as Tekken and internationally as that game with the giant controller, is a 2002 mech combat game developed by Capcom and Dune Maker for the original Xbox. It's mostly known for its legendarily enormous purpose-built controller, which itself is quite a collector's item. But it also, right, get this, is a video game. Yes, really, you can play it, there's stuff there. I think it's the coolest mech game ever made, the complete mech pilot fantasy made playable. But you wouldn't know that looking at YouTube because everybody just talks about how big the controller is. So, today we're gonna have a look at Steel Battalion, the video game. Okay, but we still gotta talk about that controller. The Steel Battalion experience starts not with the main menu, but with setting up this behemoth. Some call it the Mega Jockey 9000. Capcom calls it the Steel Battalion controller. Over 2.5 feet long and weighing 17 pounds, this absolute unit is so large that I can't physically fit it anywhere near my desk. If you have a $2,000 racing sim in your office, then I'm sure you're acclimated to this kind of thing, but for the rest of us, it's quite a hassle to get up and running. But what a controller it is! 2 sticks, 3 pedals, 5 switches, a gear switcher, a comm dial, another thumbstick, and several dozen other buttons just for good measure. Sure, it's all plastic, but you're not paying Thrustmaster Warthog money here. Aside from the gear shifter needing some finesse to not slide the entire controller around, it all feels great. You can really feel that it's purpose-built for this game, which is good, considering it doesn't work for anything else. After you've spent an hour setting all that up, you're finally ready to read the manual! What, you didn't think you were qualified to play it yet, did you? Every copy of Steel Battalion came with a 35-page technical manual covering everything you'll ever need to know to operate a mech. And a lot of things you won't! This includes, but is not limited to, the history and military applications of mechs, the physical assembly and upkeep of said mechs, how to cold start your mech, every type of weapon, every single thing in every cockpit of every mech, your mech's how to avoid having what to do if the interior of your mech catches on fire, mission updates are when to release fuel tanks to reduce weight, how to contact mission command, and logistics of opening a structure of your what to do if you're in the mech and you get hungry. So it's pretty extensive. If you're like me, you're gonna have a wonderful time reading through all this. If you didn't, well, you're probably not going to like Steel Battalion very much. But you can play it now, so let's do that. Here, let me just, yeah, there we go. We open on our character's first day of training when the base comes under attack. Our hero leaps into the cockpit of a mech in the hangar, valiantly saving the day with his knowledge from reading the manual. You did read the manual, right? The year is 2080. The island country of Haishidao, located here-ish, has withdrawn from the Pacific Rim forces and begun invading its neighbors. As a member of the PRC's 7th Special Panzer Division, it's your job to lay down the law mission by blowing everything up in a mech. A vertical tank. There's next to no narrative to speak of, and your objectives are generally straightforward. Go here, destroy that, clear however much of the enemy forces, that kind of thing. Some are full-on ground wars, but most are just you and a couple of squad mates. That all makes the game sound pretty simple. It is not. Moby Games classifies Steel Battalion as an action, simulation, and strategy game. This is technically correct. The developers classify Steel Battalion as a piloting game, which is considerably more accurate. Underneath all the missions and combat and explosions, the real core gameplay loop of Steel Battalion is just operating your VT successfully. That comically insane number of buttons, the gauges and readouts all over the cockpit, the comms dial and the gear shifter with 7 positions, they aren't just there for show. You need those. You need all of those. The manual, which I really hope you did read because the game isn't going to tell you how to do anything, gives you all the information you need on paper, but putting it into practice is a long and very difficult learning curve. Becoming truly proficient and comfortable operating your VT is likely to take upwards of 10 hours. Aside from the sheer complexity of the controls, the main reason for this is that VTs are clumsy dumpsters. In canon, they're a recent invention. The Haishidao conflict is their first major combat use, and you can tell. What we're dealing with here is less Gundam and more Bob Semple tank with legs. And a railgun. Point is, we're not working with the best the future has to offer. These big lugs are fragile and slow to maneuver. They constantly guzzle fuel and have the battery capacity of a AAA. Their viewports are narrow and faulty, and when you turn too hard at high speeds, the PC-98 running the show has an aneurysm and the whole thing topples over in the middle of combat. The humble Vitz is such hot garbage that you don't even get color. So instead of launching yourself around like it's Armored Core, vertical tanks are best used as, well, tanks. But vertical? Despite your machine's heft, combat's often quick and decisive. Charging straight in generally isn't viable. You do have an evasive move, but it dumps your battery and takes some finesse to use effectively. You'll typically get Swiss cheesed as soon as you're in over your head. The smart move is to hang back and play it safe, scoping out which routes are less defended, engaging at a distance, and using buildings and terrain to pick fights on your own terms. When you can't, you need to strike hard and fast. A few good hits from a big enough gun is enough to knock over most VTs and leave them completely exposed. So if you can find an opening to force your way into, you can make yourself a solid foothold to work off of. Actually executing that, even once you're familiar with the controls, is much more complicated than it sounds. Control of your VT is extremely granular and not at all automated. Targeting is controlled separately from your view, which is controlled separately from your VT's facing direction. Different actions increase or decrease fuel consumption, and additional fuel tanks may be detached manually to reduce equipment load. You can cycle the HUD color for better visibility. Both sub-monitors have different display modes for different situations. Your cockpit camera can get dirty for any number of reasons and must be cleaned manually. And the cockpit might catch on fire. Higher-end VTs have target forecasting systems to adjust for travel time, but depending on how both you and your target are moving, they can be thrown off and make you whiff shots. Any incoming or outgoing communication must be switched to using the tuner dial, and of course, every VT drives in manual, so get comfortable with that shifter. I absolutely love this. I've never played a game before where I had to plan my combat tactics around how physically complex to perform they are, and it's beyond satisfying to master the combat forklift. When you're late into the game and can confidently throw your hands and feet around the controller to make your VT do whatever you want, you really feel like you've earned that dexterity. That's why the controller is ultimately inseparable from the experience of Steel Battalion as a video game. Half the challenge is getting to grips with its bizarre input system. The other half is that the game would be extremely hard anyway. The second most famous thing about Steel Battalion is that it has permadeath. When your VT takes critical damage, you have about 3 seconds to press the big red eject button before it explodes, kills you, and your save is deleted. Immediately, just straight up. This is a terrifying prospect, considering a perfect playthrough can take over 8 hours, but in truth, it's not super likely to happen more than once or twice near the start. Once you have a feel for the game, it's pretty obvious when you're screwed, and you'll have no problem ejecting in time. The real threat, as always, is bankruptcy. Completing missions earns you supply points with some extra based on performance. You can use these to requisition new VTs and mid-mission resupplies, which you need to buy ahead of time. Mercifully, weapons are free. You can outfit your VT with any compatible equipment for no cost as long as you stay under the weight limit. The catch is that if something goes wrong and you need to eject, that VT is totaled and you need to pay up for a new one. They're expensive too. A successful mission can only cover the cost of 1 or 2 VTs that you actually want. And if you can't afford a new VT, you get demoted, everyone calls you a loser, save deleted. That will happen to you several times. In the end, I finished the game on Honkers the 5th. So, suffice it to say, the stakes are a little high. If you screw up, you can lose 6 hours of progress in the span of 10 seconds, which is enough to inspire complete paranoia. Letting your guard down is basically asking to be killed, and Steel Battalion is more than happy to oblige. If there's a door, you can bet that an enemy is behind it, and sometimes the Blackwater clown car will jump you in a back alley and you've got to hit the bricks. It gets mean with this stuff, though in a way that makes it kind of more manageable because you can just assume it's going to do the cruelest thing you can think of at any given moment and prepare accordingly. This means that Steel Battalion demands a very tactical playstyle. Paying close attention to briefings, thinking through your choice of loadout, and staying alert in the field is all but mandatory to get through the game at all. But it does hold up its end of the bargain. As brutally punishing as it can be, very few of my failures actually felt unwarranted. I didn't appreciate getting melted by a battleship, but I knew full well that it was my fault for tempting fate, which makes the whole permadeath thing sting a little less. This focus on strategy also softens the blow of starting over in another way. Once you've nailed down a solid approach to a mission and you have the skills to back it up, few of them are actually all that long or difficult, so you can make it back to where you were fairly quickly and with supply points to spare. All of this makes for gameplay that is incredibly stressful, but also compelling in a way I haven't really seen elsewhere. Beyond its, let's be real here, pretty awesome controller, I think Steel Battalion thinks very highly of the player. It holds astronomically high expectations of you, not just in tactics, but in mental focus and real-life physical dexterity, but it sets these confident in the knowledge that you can and will rise to them. If you couldn't, would you really be a mech pilot? That kind of tough love mentality isn't for everybody, but it's important to keep in mind what this game is and who it's for. In 2002, Steel Battalion cost $200 United States dollars, or $350 in today's money, which, when you know it, is about what I paid for it. I have a Patreon, oh god. The average person is not going to spend 2/3 the price of a console on one game, but a hardcore mecha enthusiast definitely might. That's a niche market that is willing to spend a very large amount of money on cool robots. So, you're Capcom, it's 2000, and you want to make the ultimate mech simulation game of all time, with a purpose-built controller the size of a small car. This is the only time anybody will ever do something that ridiculous, and you know it. So, what do? Well, you push it to the absolute limit, you cut no corners. You force the player to master both the mech and the controller, because if not now, then when? Not to mention, your audience is committed. If they're willing to drop that much money on the mech pilot fantasy, then being pushed to wring every ounce they can out of the machine and themselves is exactly what they want. That struggle is itself a part of the fantasy. We'll come back to that, but let's cool it for a minute and talk presentation. The word that comes to mind here is minimal. As I mentioned earlier, there is virtually no narrative to speak of. Aishidao is being bad, go beat them up. What little plot development exists in briefings in between missions is all the kind of dry military writing that's appropriate for a technical manual, but quite dull in the game. If you're willing to dive into the Japan-only guidebook, there's further details on the setting and Aishidao's president, but it's still nothing to write home about. Its complete absence in the game reflects how tangential it really is. The gold standard here is, of course, Ace Combat. Those games follow a very similar structure of telling their stories in briefings, debriefings, and occasional cutscenes between missions, but they do it with so much more flavor and character than Steel Battalion musters. Tonally, they don't quite align. Steel Battalion's obviously trying to be more grounded, but Ace Combat Zero later showed that such a narrative can work just fine that way. I don't think Steel Battalion's lack of narrative ambition detracts from what's there, and I'm not sure how well a more fleshed out story would mesh with the permadeath mechanics, but it's hard not to feel like it was a missed opportunity. Especially considering that the art design for the VTs is really cool. As mentioned earlier, this conflict is the first time they've ever seen large-scale deployment, and they really lean into the idea that you're basically driving the mech equivalent of a World War I tank. On the outside, they're very rugged and utilitarian, but then you peek inside the cockpit and it looks like half the dashboard was sourced from a used car dealership. They all use these big, grainy CRTs that visibly struggle to keep working when you push your VT to its limit, and the whole thing gives the impression that it could just break down at any time. My favorite aspect of these cockpits is that they get distinctly more advanced with each mech generation. The first gen cockpit just looks terrible. It's cramped, your viewport's tiny, and the HUD's low resolution. Your readouts are all these industrial gauges and analog light strips and poorly backlit LCDs that remind me of cheap watches. It totally smells like sweat in there. You step it up to second gen and it's immediately more advanced. The viewport is larger, the HUD is sharp, text keeps the 7-segment look, but it's all being displayed on proper screens. Some information, like the battery meter, is conveyed in a totally different format, which takes some time to adjust to. You won't get a 3rd gen VT until near the end of the game, but when you do, it finally begins to resemble the kinds of interfaces you see in more traditional depictions of mechs. The viewport's massive, and a lot of what used to be displayed physically is now a part of the HUD. The font is sleek, and no analog gauges remain, replaced with digital ones that are more appropriate for the degree of power the 3rd gens bring to the table. It really sells the impression that what we're seeing here is a developmental precursor to the classic mecha style, rather than a strictly realistic vision of what mechs could one day look like. Obviously, by 2002, we knew we probably weren't going to be putting CRTs in mechs 80 years down the line, but positioned as a prototype for the futuristic design motifs of its inspiration, it feels strikingly authentic. If you extrapolate this progression out another handful of generations, it's easy to picture it landing on something resembling a Gundam cockpit. On a technical level, the visuals are simple, but fine. It plays it safe with fairly plain environments, but there's more going on here than you might initially notice, or be able to perceive with YouTube compression. The developers took advantage of the Xbox's GPU horsepower to pull off some nice visual effects for the time, though their implementation is pretty subtle. The CRTs have a convincing graininess to them, and objects near your VT's cameras, like your weapons, get a bit of depth of field blur applied. It's so discreet that I didn't even notice it for a while, but it's a surprisingly tasteful use of it for the time, and it helps the game's visuals hold up decently well. It's not perfect, though. The render distance is glaringly short across the board. It doesn't really affect gameplay because your minimap's enough to get around, but the environments just look weird sometimes because of it. As for the soundtrack, there is no soundtrack. Okay, that's not strictly true. There's nice enough music in the menus and cutscenes, but they're 22 kHz and they don't sound great. In gameplay, there's no music at all, but if you want, you can buy a boombox and shove it into your cockpit to play the world's most comically low-quality tapes. Sorry, I'm getting a little interference, what'd you say? Not that you'd really want to anyway. We're going for realism here. The game wants you locked in at all times, so the sound design takes center stage instead. And that's really good! VTs sound appropriately hefty with big, satisfying stomps and chunky mechanical sounds for everything you do, while gunfire and explosions have this delightfully bassy rumble to them. It's good enough that I never really lamented the absence of a soundtrack, especially since the most climactic moments already sound like you're in a tumble dryer full of hand grenades. But the controller is what really brings the presentation together, though it's in a way it's hard to convey through video. On the surface level, it's big and it lights up, and that's obviously pretty cool. It's the effect that it has when you're in the pilot seat that's more difficult to articulate. I feel like just showing straight gameplay capture of Steel Battalion doesn't quite do justice to what it actually looks like to play the game. This controller is so ludicrously large that it becomes a visual aspect of the game in and of itself, extending the cockpit out of the game and into real space. It lends more physicality to the virtual side just by association. And that's where we get into the tactile aspect of it. I'd wager that the third most famous thing about Steel Battalion is the startup sequence. Every mission begins with a little song and dance to get your mech up and running. It's a simple process, trivial to execute as long as you've read the manual. So why include it? Well, the official guidebook can tell us.
Close the hatch and press the ignition button. Flip on the toggle switches one by one. You have to do this every time you sortie. Additionally, these buttons and switches are only used when starting the VT. Modern games would simply skip these small steps and put you straight into the action. However, this concept is not allowed in Techie. These operations are a vital ritual to actually become a pilot. What is Techie? It's what the creators wanted to make and the players thought would make an awesome game. This game lies somewhere in the middle of the creator's vision and the player's fantasies.
What Steel Battalion aims for, and what I've never seen another game aim for, is the complete eradication of abstraction. Okay, this is gonna get a little esoteric for a second, so just bear with me. In your average game, control is totally abstracted. Let's take, Mechazult, for example. This game uses a very standard control scheme. You play it with the regular Xbox controller, the left stick moves you relative to the camera's orientation, the right stick rotates the camera, and the mech always faces where you're looking. Your controls direct the mech's general actions as they pertain to gameplay, moving, aiming, shooting, and so on, but it's obviously assumed that piloting the mech doesn't actually work that way in-universe. I mean, it's Battletech, so it definitely doesn't. That's to say that these controls are abstracted. They don't directly equate to anything in a fictional sense. If we move up the chain of realism, we can get closer, but never quite there. Arma gives you very fine control over your character's actions, but pressing the C key is obviously still nothing like the actual action of crouching. Okay, then VR games. These definitely get closer. To crouch, you literally have to crouch, but some abstraction is necessary just due to the limits of physical reality. The shape and texture of the controllers in your hands can't change according to the thing you're holding, nor can you actually walk into infinite distance within the confines of your bedroom. It's getting there, but it still needs a layer of abstraction for anything that isn't contrived to match reality. But the logical conclusion is to spend thousands of dollars constructing a painstaking recreation of an A-10 cockpit in your garage, which... Alright, you got me there. But for everyone else, you're stuck using a consumer HOTAS for flight sims, and they're not going to be anywhere near the control setup of an actual plane. What sets Steel Battalion apart is that in the game, the manual, the promotional material, everything, the controller is treated as a complete and literal one-to-one representation of the controls of a VT. If you got stomped on by Vitskun, isekai into Haishi Dao, conscripted into the PRF, and dropped into a decider for the beach landing, it would operate completely identically to playing Mission 1 of Steel Battalion. And that is the magic of the startup sequence. From the moment you lower the cockpit and flick those switches, you are engrossed in the mech pilot fantasy in its purest form. You become the pilot. The way the targeting stick doesn't recenter itself, the weight of the pedals, the feel as the comms dial clicks from position to position, all of it is precisely and comprehensively what it is like to pilot a VT. Who's to say otherwise? They invented them, and it all feels just heavy enough, just difficult enough, just real enough for you to believe them when they say it really does work this way. It is impeccably immersive. I've played a lot of games, like really a lot of games, and few have ever managed to feel so completely enthralling as Steel Battalion does. And it just couldn't have achieved this without the controller, without being so outwardly excessive as it is. It bothers me when I see people just regard it as being big and gimmicky and nothing more. I mean, I get it is really big, and that's clearly more intuitive than a philosophical rant about control abstraction, but after playing the game, I think its size is the least interesting thing about it. So, is Steel Battalion secretly a flawless video game? No, it is not. While the controller is a massive flex, it's not hard to tell that the budget for the game itself wasn't especially high. Cutscenes are sparse with basic presentation, briefings don't have voice acting, and what little there is sounds like they just grabbed whoever was in the office at the time and called it a day. And the dialogue at the end of every mission gets cut off every time, and that annoys me more than it probably should. Most environments look alright, but every now and then you get dropped into the height mappiest height maps that ever height mapped. On the gameplay side, the friendly AI is beyond helpless. It's a good thing that their health is inflated to the moon because they couldn't navigate their way out of a cardboard box, let alone survive combat. You have to accept that you're going to be doing everything yourself and just leave them be. If you're lucky, they'll draw some fire, and if you're not, you'll be stuck in a traffic jam. But the biggest issue, by far, is performance. You know, Steel Battalion was originally going to be a PS2 game. I shudder to think what that would look like, because the Xbox is a lot more powerful and the game still barely runs. I can live with the draw distance being short, but the frame rate is just a bridge too far. The problem isn't lag, it's slowdown. On urban maps, it's not uncommon to spend half the mission in bullet time. You can even feel the lurch in game speed as you go in and out of areas it's struggling with. In some sense, it's kind of helpful, because the game dropping to 20 FPS means you're wrangling the controls 50% faster than usual, but that sure doesn't help the immersion. Missions in the capital city especially can be a slog to play because of this. Once you finish the offensive and hit the credits, you unlock a second campaign set in 2082. This is mainly a remix of the first campaign's missions, with a few entirely new ones tossed in. You can start a character straight from the second campaign once you've unlocked it. Without having ranked up to the first campaign, you won't be able to use 3rd gen VTs. Having gotten my teeth kicked in by the first campaign, I expected this one to be a lot harder, but while the missions are technically more difficult, I think it's ultimately the easier of the two. Part of it's that you have a solid VT roster from the get-go, and the early missions are still easy enough that you can just kind of blow straight through them. At this stage, just needing to clear enemies isn't that much of a challenge, especially since the weak VTs and early missions can't put up that much of a fight against the Gen 2. The port mission's a tough nut to crack the first time around, but in 2082, you can pretty much just flatten everything with the railgun. The biggest factor though is that the learning curve for the controls is already behind you. If you're comfortable piloting a VT, no mission the game can throw at you is beyond what you're capable of. In that regard, the second campaign feels like a nice victory lap, and I was able to clear it on my first go. What definitely doesn't help is your new squad. The 2082 campaign's biggest mechanical addition is that you've become the leader of X-Ray Platoon, a pair of bumbling toddlers in mechs whose only purpose in life is bugging you on the radio. You issue commands to them using the comms panel, but for some reason you have to pick 2 of the 4 commands to be able to use ahead of time. The controller has 5 comms buttons, and 3 of them are permanently bound to specific functions regardless of who you're talking to. 2 of them are useless when talking to your squad mates, so this is a strange limitation. It'd probably be annoying if they weren't totally useless either way. Hilariously, this means that when your squad mates are either critically damaged and need to disengage, you're probably incapable of letting them do so. I'm sure they'll be fine. Who's that calling on the telephone? I see! The last mission's a gauntlet as you raid Haishi Dao's last citadel. It's a real test with the most well-defended exterior in the game, followed by tight interior passages packed with just truly obscene numbers of enemies. In the end, you face off with this, like, mecha sphinx, which is fiddly to damage, but it has such bad mobility that it's ultimately not too threatening. I'm not sure why you fight it in some kind of ancient temple, but sure, why not? And as I slumped back in my chair while the credits rolled for the final time, I got a notification from my bank pointing out that I spent more than usual last month. I couldn't imagine a more appropriate conclusion. Steel Battalion is awesome. It's not perfect, but it fulfills the mech pilot fantasy in a way nothing else ever has, and as ostentatious as the controller seems, I don't think it'd be so effective without it. For me, the game is an easy recommendation for any mech fan if you can play it. That's obviously a big if. You're going to be spending upwards of $300 for the controller, or even more if you don't already have an Xbox, and you've got to be a pretty specific kind of person to be up for that. Within a few years, I'm sure emulating the game with keyboard and mouse controls is going to become fairly accessible, but it's not really the same. The real physical controller is an inseparable part of the experience. Trying to make do with anything less is like trying to play a sim racer with the arrow keys. That's just the nature of the beast. I don't have a solution for it. The series did continue after this first installment. Multiplayer was initially planned for Steel Battalion, and while it was cut early in development, the team returned to the idea after the game shipped. The result was Steel Battalion Line of Contact, a multiplayer-only spin-off released in 2004 alongside a second run of the original set. But that's a can of worms I look forward to opening some other time. 8 years later, we got Steel Battalion Heavy Armor, which is a Kinect game developed by FromSoft? I don't look forward to that one so much. Will we ever see the return of Steel Battalion? No, we won't. I mean, come on, seriously? Physical game sales in general are dying out, let alone ones with comically large peripherals that only work for one specific series. At best, I could maybe see them releasing an entry for VR platforms. And while that would be pretty sick and someone should totally do it, it would still lack the physicality that makes the original work so well. That's kind of a bummer, but at the end of the day, I'm just glad Steel Battalion got to exist in the first place. It's a singularly unique game in a way that could only have been achieved in the time it was made, and it's never really gotten the credit it deserves for that. So next time you see someone bask in the spectacle of the Mega Jockey 9000, go ahead and join them. But make sure they know that Steel Battalion isn't just a controller. Welcome to the Credits Q&A! If you want to ask a question here, you can do so by supporting me on Patreon or YouTube to help offset the ungodly amount of money I spent on this video. What possessed you to purchase that absurdly expensive controller or decide to play the game to begin with? Well, I always kind of wanted to. Aside from it being pretty much the ultimate jewel in the crown for any collector that has it, the game just looked cool, and I wanted to see what they were doing that really needed a controller like that. As for finally pulling the trigger, well, this video is really the only way I could ever hope to justify that. After having played Steel Battalion, has it inspired you to consume every mecha media ever? It's hard to say, but that Battletech in my Steam library is looking pretty good right about now. If you don't hear from me in the next month, you know what happened.